as you can see from the structure of this conference, we're really interested in the way that computer games and video games relate to other kinds of games. But I also think that there's kind of a deeper connection between all games and the ideas, the fundamental ideas of computers and programming and numbers. Even in sports, you see this kind of relationship between the fluidity and the complexity and the ambiguity of human action and the sort of discrete precision of a binary outcome. Right, so even in football, we see the gridiron, right? The gridiron in the football field is a way of taking the smooth analog space of the football pitch and dividing it up into chunks. It's almost like football is already partially like a digital game because we want to take space and chop it up into pixels, almost like Minecraft, right? And I also think, for me, one of the interesting underlying themes here is the idea of the two cultures, right? C.P. Snow's idea that in the university and in intellectual culture overall, in the 20th century, you've seen this division between people who are passionate about and interested in literature and the arts, and people who are passionate about and interested in engineering and science and analytical thinking. And in some ways, these two communities of people, there's not all that much overlap, right? There's some people who see the world in this particular way, and there's other people who see the world in this other way. And it's kind of a problem. Like a well-rounded person in the 21st century should be conversant with both of these ways of thinking about the world. They should know about Samuel Beckett and why that is beautiful and important and a deep expression of what it means to be alive. And they should also know about the second law of thermodynamics and what that says about what it means to be alive. And many people don't, right? They're either in one of these two camps. I've often felt that games, and especially video games, embody a solution to this problem, that they are both of those things at the same time. That to play games, but especially to make games, is to be deeply embedded in both of those ways of looking at the universe. Not just because games are an art form that is built on top of engineering, but also because the engineering itself in games is a creative expression. The engineering, the computer programming is itself an expressive act within the art form of games. And so, for people like me, and I've had this conversation with Ken Perlin, who is one of the leaders of the computer science community here at NYU and internationally. We've talked about this a lot, about how games in the university can be a bridge between these two cultures and maybe a way forward for all of us to think about these things and to look at the world in a way that's more unified and combined. So I'm really excited about talking about how these things relate to each other, game design and programming, and I'm also hoping to maybe get some debate and differences of opinion between our panelists who represent a full spectrum. So we tried to find people from Chris Hecker, who is a programmer through and through and a game designer at the same time, and for him he's doing both of these things simultaneously. Manveer Heir, who is a trained programmer and computer engineer, who now does design. He still can program and occasionally does do code, but his full-time job now is game design. To Nick Fortugno, who is, as far as I know, not a programmer at all, kind of a pure game designer who doesn't program. So we want to get all these different perspectives and figure out
What about you, Frank?
And me, who is basically a non-programming game designer with a fascination for code and someone who's trying to learn. So as part of this panel, as moderating this panel, I've started to myself try to learn programming a little bit more. I've done a little bit of programming in the past, and now I'm trying to get back into it. So for the past few weeks, I've been trying to learn Python. So that's where I am now as a novice. Yay! We'll see. And I do. I'm gonna code a game in the next over the next 6 months, my copious spare time. So so we're gonna start. Each of these guys gonna do a little bit of a brief introduction to the way they think about this topic, and then we'll jump into conversation. So we'll start with Chris Hecker, who needs no introduction, brilliant programmer and game designer and developer. He's worked on a bunch of different games, including Spore. He was one of the leaders in designing and creating the Creature Creator, which many people think is kind of the best part of that game. And he's also been talking about stewardship. I think Chris is genuinely a steward of the game development community, a person who's been very active in organizing and things like the Experimental Gameplay Workshop and Indie Game Jam and the GDC itself and all of these things, and currently working on the Indie Game Spy Party, which we're all excited about. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris Hecker.
I'm going to keep this super brief. I realized halfway through Frank talking that this looks like it's up here to like impress you with like computer code. It looks like but this is actually, I'm trying to figure out why my lobby server out there is crashing all the time. So this is like, and I had to split the screen before I like loaded this SSH, so I'm like, all right, okay, it hasn't gone down yet. So what I actually, my comments on this topic are pretty brief, and I used to be more, well, this is probably a false statement, but I used to be a little more vitriolic about this topic. We'll see how it goes. So I'll just kind of give you my opinion of how I see things. I have a very simple, what I would call kind of like, one might use the word airtight logical argument for why you should learn how to program. So I'll go through that. But first, I was at Indiecade a couple weeks ago and was talking about this topic with some people at lunch and whatever, and then this is Brenda Brathwaite, and she had a couple comments. I was like, oh wait, you gotta, because she had just talked to you like an hour before or something, yes. And I was like, well, he didn't have a video camera with him, did he? So I video recorded. And so I'm just gonna play a snippet of this. We'll see if this works. Yes.
No.
How is it mean? It's a debate. It's an intellectual debate. Contribute.
She's seen it. She's seen the proof.
Contribute to the intellectual debate.
All right. I will give you both sides of the debate. I am half the designer I could be if I learned how to code.
All right. So that's all we need to hear about that. Okay, I'll play the rest.
At some point, take 2 years off and learn how to code in C. And then 6502.
That 6502 thing is Romero's influence. I think that hopefully will just not waste your time.
If I had known how to code, I would never have been forced to express myself non-digitally, and I never would have made Train. And I never would have made the Irish game, and I never would have made any of those games.
You know that for a fact?
I absolutely know that for a fact.
All right.
Because I needed to make a game, and I didn't have a programmer who could do it. So the desire to create came out in that direction because I didn't have any code at my disposal. So those games definitely would not have existed without code. So then I'd start before you and against you.
There you go.
And I'm going to learn in C.
So I would make a claim if she was twice as good a designer, then the games that would have come out would have been better, but who knows? So the key thing is, for me, the little kind of pat logical argument I have is that it has two axioms that you just have to buy, and if we don't agree with these, then we're just working in different mediums. Number one is that the fundamental differentiator of games as an art form is interactivity, and interactivity is this systemic, procedural, reactive. The computer presents something to you, you react to it internally, you present input back to the computer, it turns on that, and it's a feedback loop, right? So that is a inherently systemic technical thing in the sense of like the interaction may be a completely emotional interaction, but what's going on there is a computer's executing code. In the case of board games, if we want to get all precise, like there's still an algorithm, it just happens to be running in players, you're evaluating the rule set. So there's a procedural thing. So that's axiom number one. Axiom number two is that all of it matters. As you try and increase quality of the interactive experience, everything starts to matter. Every if statement, every whether it's a 0.01 or a 0.011, that all starts to matter. You see this in like the thing about fighting games yesterday. It's like one frame difference makes it. Completely revolutionizes the game. And those things are impossible to predict. So you have to have control over those variables and see what's going on, know what's happening. So if you buy those two axioms that one, it is an inherently systemic thing that we're doing, and two, that as you increase quality, you need that every little piece of the code, the rubber hits the road at the code, every instruction matters. Then my argument is simply that you want to close the gap between the implementation and the design, and you want them because there is no actual gap at the limit of quality because every if statement matters, and that's programming. And so having as tight a feedback loop as possible between the design and the programming is key to quality, and the best way to do that is to have them within one brain. So it is obviously prima facie true that you can make a game without having the designer and the programmer be the same person. However, I think that as the quality increases, that is the better way to do it. Or at the very least have the designer be able to communicate very clearly and systemically about the algorithms in play to the programmers, and if you can do that, then you can program. Because it's like programming is not so much about where you put the semicolons, it's about how your brain works. So that's my argument.
Nice. Okay, so we're next going to hear a brief statement from Manveer Heir. Manveer has been working in the game industry for 5 years, 6 years. Started out as a programmer, worked his way up to lead game designer, so we already have a weird hierarchy. And is currently the senior game designer on the Mass Effect series at BioWare. So Manveer here.
So yeah, I'll introduce myself a little more than that, just to give you a background of where I'm coming from, so you can understand why my biases are what my biases are. So at the age of 15, I decided I want to make video games for a living, and I decided, well, how do I do that? And frankly, I'm Indian, so I had, of course, a father that worked in like computer science. So I picked up one of his programming books, and I just started learning how to code. Just because like I knew that if I wanted to work in games, I needed to be able to do something in games. Like you didn't get like hired to just have cool ideas. Like I knew that shit would not fly. So I was like, well, what can I learn like that will like make me be able to work on the games that I want to make when I grow up? So then I decided to go to college. I went to Virginia Tech in 2000, graduated in 2004 with a degree in computer science. Shortly after that, I started at Big Huge Games on Rise of Legends as an intern programmer. Was there for a whopping 1 month before I got a full-time offer at Raven Software as a gameplay programmer. Now at Raven, there were no game designers. There was level designers, there was a creative director, and there were like gameplay designers, or gameplay programmers, excuse me. And as a gameplay programmer, I did some design stuff, but then I also did the low-level implementation. For example, I wrote like this whole vehicle simulation system for Wolfenstein that never shipped to the game when it came out in 2009. And so I did that for a while, but we were having lots of problems on Wolfenstein for many, many years. And finally someone said, hey, you really talk about game design a lot. We want someone to do that role. Will you do that? I'm like, and that was my dream. That's what I always wanted to do. I just figured I had to go checkers route and do like 10 plus years, as a programmer before I'd get there. So I got very, very lucky. And then I finished off, Wolfenstein as a game designer. I was a lead designer on an unfortunately canceled project, and now I'm a gameplay designer on Mass Effect 3. So that's where I've come from. And so the way I view myself is like a hybrid class, right? Like I'm a designer first. That's the way I think. That's the way reason and what I wanted to do when I grew up. But I learned how to program it through like basically out of necessity. Like to know how to do the things, to be able to do them on my own and not rely on others. Like I'm just not a trusting person, so I don't want to rely on other people that I don't trust to do what I think I can do. And so for me, it's always been a way to implement my own ideas. Like, and also I'm not a big fan of specs and docs. Like I don't think specs and docs are bad. I think they're important, and there's a time and place for them. But like I know game designers who only want to work on paper or in Excel sheets, and that they only want to have that go, and they want that to go as long as possible. And the way I kind of work is like I want to implement something like fast and rapidly and dirty and just start playing with it, because so much emerges out of when you actually implement a system that you never would have thought of on paper. So think about the things that you know on paper, but don't try to get it perfect, because you're not going to get it perfect. At least that's the way I've approached it. And what I really find is that when you implement a system, there's like 1,000 decisions you have to make that you never would have considered like at that paper stage. Like you're just not gonna, and they're like really small minor decisions, and you don't even realize your decisions are making it, but they matter. And so if I give a spec to a programmer, I'm asking that programmer to implement that, versus me, the person who knows how the system is supposed to work. And I think the more that I can do that, the better off that I am. But the dirty little secret is I don't like to program. Like, I just do not enjoy like sitting there and programming. Every day on Mass Effect 3, I write Unreal script code to like get the powers working, and like I like the end result of what I do. Like, oh, I got him to do that, and he cast that, and that's really cool. But programming is like the grinding quest that I have to do to get that little piece of enjoyment and satisfaction in my life. And I'm happy to do it to get there, but it's not what I love. So I don't think you have to program your own systems, but I do think it's really important to understand programming because of what Chris just said, like understanding the systemic interactions between our games. Like, our games are systems, and logically, like at least to me they are. And so the more that we understand them, like the more that we understand what I think is probably the quote unquote true nature of games. Like, I think we can understand the core of maybe what games really are. And that's really interesting to me. And more so, as a designer, we have lots of tools in our tool belt, right? Like, why would I not have that extra tool that I can pull upon at times? I might not need to use it. I might not need to use it regularly. Like, I hope that I come to a day where I'm not programming every single day, like coding, and that I can work on some more high-level stuff and then get nitty-gritty when necessary. But the fact that I know how to code means I can ask the programmers on my team the right questions, I can communicate with them effectively, and that I can bring up ideas and thoughts from a technical point of view that designers who don't often cannot. And so I have a challenge for anybody in this room, not anybody who's watching on video, because that's just too many people, but anybody in this room. If you don't know how to program currently, and you are willing to try to learn, take a good shot at learning how to program, and if you can learn how to program and come back to me, you know, half a year from now and say, that did not make me a better designer in any way. There's a restaurant in New York City called Masa. It is a 3-star Michelin star restaurant. It's about, I think you just said $1,500 for 2 people to eat there. It's a very expensive restaurant. I will personally take you out to dinner next time I'm in the city to Masa if you can demonstrate that you took a good shot at learning how to program and it did not make you a better designer. I'm more than happy to take you out for a $1,500 dinner and discuss that and design as a whole. So that's my challenge. Yes. Thank you.
I love that. I love betting. I think betting is good. So our third panelist is Nick Fortugno. Nick and I have worked together quite a bit. Boom! And you know, so Nick has a background in things like live action role playing and sort of improvisational theater as it relates to games. We worked together at Game Lab. Nick is one of the pioneers of sort of casual online downloadable games. So working on things like Diner Dash, we worked together on that. He has gone on to do lots of interesting work in the social space and in all kinds of other areas, and is currently the Chief Creative Officer of Playmatics. So Nick Fortugno.
First of all, I would thank you for your fairness, Chris, in showing the whole quote. So I don't really disagree with anything that was said for the most part before this, and I sort of want to come at this from 2 perspectives. The first is to say that I would not take your challenge. I definitely think I would be a better game designer if I were a better programmer. I have programmed a little bit in my past. I used to do BASIC when I was in elementary school, and then that was it. I sort of fell off that train. And I think that history is actually kind of interesting, right? Because I fell off that train. I actually liked programming. I thought it was kind of cool, and had I been in a context where I thought that was important at that time, I probably would have kept programming and kept going. But instead, I started studying math. I started studying science. Then I decided I hated labs. Then I started studying literature much more seriously. Then I got very into literature, and I pursued master's education in literature. And my focus really got around story in a very deep way, and I just sort of lost programming along the way. Now, would I be a better designer if I were a better programmer? Absolutely, right? But as Frank mentioned, games, as they're understood as digital games, are a collaborative craft. I mean, they're a craft that involves many, many different people, and we're not unique for that. Movies are the same thing, theater is the same thing. So I would be a better game designer if I were a better artist. And I'm a horrific artist. I'm actually a much worse artist than I am a programmer, I think. I would be a better game designer if I understood audio better. I'd be a better game designer if I had a degree in cognitive psychology. I'd be a better game designer if I had a study in cultural science that was better. I'd be a better game designer if I could translate my own games, right? Like, all of those things would make me a better programmer. The question is that, I think there's a question about what when you come to the position of game design and you ask yourself, what is the role? What is the role of game design in a production team? The question is, what will make me the most effective person to do my job? And I don't think a privileging of programming over all of these other disciplines that are sort of equally important to the success of the game, because I would argue that as much as a digital game, as we understand it, leaving aside sort of like radical experimentation, is an expression of a computer system, it's also expression of a visual design space. And insofar as it's the expression of a visual design space, then every percentage of that visual design space is also essential, and the game designer should be able to the ideal game designer we're imagining here should be able to comment down to the pixel spacing of everything on the screen. And I think that an inability to do that does not disqualify one from being a game designer, just like the inability to implement code does not disqualify one from being a game designer. That's the point of working on a team. I can outsource that expertise to other people who can do that kind of implementation. Game design is about systems thinking, but systems thinking is not a prerequisite of programming. And I think my experience points that out, that I think in systems all the time, but I didn't come to it from a programming perspective. And if that makes me a programmer in some weird abstract way, then that's fine. But I can't bring that to a level of implementation of code. I would never argue I could, and I don't disrespect programmers for doing that. I think it's a wonderful skill, and I think it's a necessary skill, obviously, to the field. But my point is that where I focused was story. That's what I focused on, and I think that was another dimension that games have that can be very relevant to gameplay and very relevant to game design. And my focus on that, against my focus on programming, I don't think has hurt me as a game designer. And when I think about game designers who come from a background of art direction, or game designers who come from a background of audio direction, or game designers who come from a background of cultural study, I don't think they are disadvantaged relative to their craft insofar as they're working on a team. Now, I can't make a digital game by myself, right? That I think is the one big difference between programming and these other fields. If I had the capacity in all of these other fields, I could basically make a game by myself. But I'm not interested in making a game by myself because I disagree, ultimately, and this is the one big disagreement I have, about the feedback loop system you were talking about, Chris. I don't think that working in one's own head is necessarily a way to create good content. I think that a collaborative environment that games produce is a lot of what produces the good content that we make, and the fact that I have to have a creative tension with an implementer pushes me into design situations that are interesting and challenging. So I think that the idea that I have to have a conversation with my programmer about how we can implement something leads me to design better as a result. If I knew that myself, that conversation would never happen. And I think that's part of what I hear in what Brenda's saying, is that the fact that we have to negotiate these limitations actually puts us in an interesting position vis-a-vis what we do. So insofar as I have limited time in the world and I can't know everything I need to know, I think it's good for me to focus on something, and that something does not necessarily have to be programmed. All right.
First of all, I just want to give you guys a chance. Is there anything that pops up?
The argument I was making about feedback did not actually have it did not assume that the lack of the tightness of that feedback loop led to the quality, right? It just meant that it got stuff out of the way, that if you were the kind of person who was going to make that quality in the first place, that it's the thing. So it has nothing, I guess. The argument, are you arguing that it is not lower friction if it's in one's own head? Now, it might be lower friction to get to a shitty game. I'm not trying to say anything about that, but I'm just saying, if you've got an awesome game and you're trying to get it out into the world, the lowest friction way, I think, I can imagine, is to have it in one's head. Now, collaboration is great and everything, but that's almost orthogonal to that argument.
Well, I don't think the issue is friction, right? I think that yes, what you say is true. If you have an awesome game, and the awesome game is sort of set in a way, or the process of getting to the awesome game is set in a way that you will get from ideation to implementation without any hiccups or problems.
Well, I mean, everything goes wrong all the time, but
right. So if we assume that, then what is the better situation in which things go wrong? Is it the situation in which one person is just sort of processing the whole thing in an internal way, or is it better when there's a group of people sort of jamming on the problem? And my experience has been that it's much better for me as a creator, and it might be idiosyncratic to my creation, but I don't think it is, to be in a situation where I have other voices to get me out of an overspecified or an egocentric or a myopic sense of what my project is.
Sure, but that's, I mean, taking feedback is important no matter what, right? Playtesting and talking to peers and all of these things, but I don't think that has anything to do with trying to close that gap between design and implementation.
But I think that there's a process.
You can force feedback into that loop, but it's not necessarily, I don't think there's any evidence for or against that's the best place to force that feedback as opposed to putting it in a different place in that loop or whatever. You know what I mean? I guess I'm just trying to say if things go off the rails and you need feedback, you should take feedback no matter whether you're a single programmer designer or an artist designer or an artist programmer or anything, right? It's once you know the path to take, there's infinitely more friction when you have to communicate that to somebody else.
Yeah, but I don't think games are about knowing the path to take most of the time. I think games are about stumbling through the path to take, and as long as I'm stumbling through the path to take, I want more people involved in it. Because I think the dirty secret about this, which I believe, so my offering to the programming side of this debate, because I really believe this, is that programmers make design decisions all the time.
Oh, yeah,
Because
yeah,
even when you
that's
write
what I'm saying, yeah.
specs, like they're not complete, and like I can't tell you how many times working with Peter Nicolai, he's just sort of like, well, you didn't answer this question, so I answered it for you.
Yeah.
Is this okay?
Yeah.
Right? And like, yeah, I mean, I rely on Peter to do that in certain ways because I do think there are nuts and bolts implementation steps that are necessary. But I really think that's where the game design position makes sense, right? Game designers are not about should not be like game designers, not level designers, right? Should not be about trees, right? We should be about forests.
See, I just think it's fractal. It's just all the way up. It doesn't matter whether it's like, you know, my elevator pitch is like a cocktail party and one person's controlled by the player, and like, or like, you know, when you push the A button, there's 250 milliseconds of latency on this thing. Like, it's a continuum. There's no break.
There's a way to get lost in that. Like, so again, like I said, I don't really like programming. So like, if I did what you're doing on Spy Party, I worked on my own, I come up with the design, I implemented it. The implementation details of I gotta write an IK solver, I gotta do this animation system, like that would like ruin my ability to see the bigger thing. Right? I would get buried in that, and I would get lost for a moment, and that would always be a concern. And like Nick, I work better when I can bounce ideas. It's not even that like I need feedback; it's that I need a sounding board.
Yeah.
I need to go like, hey, I have this idea. Like I work in a Montreal office, and I work with a bunch of guys from the Edmonton office, and like they get in 2 hours later. There are times I'm sitting at my desk in the morning, and I have nobody because I'm the only game designer on the project in Montreal right now. I have no one to talk to about my problem, and I'm like, I need you.
That's when the tweets start.
Yeah.
Somebody talk to me.
I don't have pants on. No, but like that's like, I need just someone to bounce an idea off of, even if it's just validation.
Right, but that's but I guess what I don't understand how that's not like Jonathan Blow and I like live near each other. Like we're both working on similar games in the sense of like, you know, AAA indie attempts at like deeper or whatever. Like we talk to each other all the time, right? We constantly are bouncing ideas off each other and stuff like that. But it doesn't have anything to do with that's orthogonal, I think, to the thing. Like it's not you can but by being able to do both, it's kind of like your tool belt argument.
Right.
By being able to do both, you can decide when to insert the feedback. It's not forced on you.
No, that I agree with. My distinction is the need to actually have to be able to program versus the knowledge of how to program, giving you the ability to express yourself correctly, to minimize it. Yes, you're probably right. Like the friction probably is lower in one's own head, but I don't know if it's that much greater if you're able to express yourself correctly. And I think the background of programming. You said you programmed for a little bit. I bet that actually has influence.
Oh yeah, if you did
already,
math,
right?
I think that totally helps. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, well, but I think so. There's a distinction here, right? And I think it's an important distinction. I want to get back to the earlier point, but I think this is an important distinction, which I kind of want to hear people who program answer this because I shouldn't. I disqualify myself from ignorance. I think there's actually two different, and I think you're pointing this out. We're actually talking about two different things. We're talking about an ability to think logically and go through a set of logical processes, and an ability to implement code into something that works. And that's not necessarily, it's not just where you put the semicolons. I think it's also knowing that like this engine doesn't like it when you do this, and you have to kind of you have to know these sort of tricks of how this, like, how memory works in this kind of situation, right? And that's actually a really detailed craft that is not doesn't inherently come from logical thinking.
I think that, well, again, I actually think much in the same way that I think the design thing is just a fractal continuum thing. I think the programming thing is a fractal continuum. If you can walk yourself through a mathematical proof, if you did math in past high school kind of thing, you could learn how to program if you chose to. No, it may be that I mean, there certainly are, like, the craft end of it is like, programming is stupid. Like, there's so much stupid nonsense you have to do to get the fucking thing to compile. It's just idiotic, right? Like, there's no question. Computers are like, they did the Stanford guys, Nass and Reeves did this study a long time ago about computers. People think about computers as another person, a human personality, and so they decided to psychoanalyze that person by like interviewing me, and like it's a passive-aggressive asshole basically. Right? It's just like, I mean, it's like you're nothing, everything's I'm ignoring, no, you're wrong. It's just like it's totally. So there's no question that it's a disaster from that standpoint. But I do think it's just a continuum because you get that same thing in math. Like you're like, fuck, why don't this like, oh right, it wasn't helping you. It's just it's there. You have to, that ability to do that, and it's just some people can do it and some people can't, and I don't think it doesn't make you a better person or anything like that. It's just a skill, whether you can or not, right? Like, but that, if you have that ability, then you can program. And my claim is, the farther you can take that, Now your argument about like it being like so much overhead, the cognitive overhead that is distracting from the thing is an interesting thing. We can talk about that. I mean, I don't know how that's like. I think there's probably like different personalities deal with that kind of cognitive load differently or whatever. I don't know what the right thing is.
Well, I'm stupid is the problem. So it's like, like the issue is like if I try to write something on my own, like if I got someone who's actually a good programmer, they're just going to implement it 10 times faster, which actually means I can iterate on it faster, which means I can implement the designs I want faster. Versus like, oh, I tried to write it, and like if you put me in front of a code that I don't want to write, like I go on Twitter and I start screwing around, and like I just find ways to get distracted because I don't want to do it. And I'm a spoiled little brat that way. I'm like, I don't want to do this. So I distract myself. So like, that's always been my problem. Speed.
I'm curious about this idea of friction, which has come up, and reducing friction. Nick, am I correct in sort of interpreting part of what you're saying is like the friction is good?
Yes,
like you want friction.
Yeah.
Well,
is that a possibility?
You want constraints. You don't want friction.
No,
Why
you want
don't
friction.
you want? Yeah, is it friction?
Yeah, you want
Can't friction be a part of this design process?
I literally, yeah, no, I mean, thank you for bringing that up. I literally want to say this. I literally want the ball to slow down as it's moving. Like I literally want that. I don't want to run away with my ideas and just go because I feel like there's 100 microscopic decisions that are being made along the way that I'm not being critical about in that go. And that friction allows me to sort of like stop all the time and say like, okay, well, what did I actually mean? And oh, wait, now I'm looking at the visual design of the screen and it's like, some decision was made here that I can see now. But if I were making it, I would just flown
ends,
through
not
it.
means thing. Like friction's a means thing, and that looking at the screen and seeing that as an ends thing. Like so if you had gotten there 3 days earlier, you would have been able to make the decision based on what the screen looks like 3 days earlier.
Right.
That's friction. Friction. The ends thing is like this didn't meet our constraints, or this sucks, or I didn't think about that. Like turning left is like feels really laggy or whatever. Like, but getting there faster is how can that possibly be a bad thing?
Because if I assume I have an awesome idea and I just run with the awesome idea, I may lack critical perspective on the awesome idea that friction forces me to have because things just naturally slow down.
I guess I just disagree fundamentally with that's where feedback happens. I think this is getting to this like where do you plug feedback into your system? And it's like the faster you can get something up on the screen and running, the faster you can get feedback that's meaningful. The friction of like, no, what I meant here was blah blah blah. No, he's got to. That's the useless friction. That's the reason that games take forever, right, to make.
Oh no, I totally don't think that friction is useless because there's creativity in that moment. Right? Like Peter will come back to me with something I never thought about because I didn't answer a question and it's good.
No, but that's different. That is because it's not spec'd out enough, which meaning you didn't program it yourself or whatever. Like there's a difference between like what I'm trying to say is like those if statements, like I don't know what to do, whether this should be a less than or less than or equal. You didn't say what it should do, so I'll either make the decision myself as a programmer or I'll come back and ask you the question, right? You as the implementer and the designer just would do it. Now, at the end of the day, when you're gonna play test your thing and you're gonna like play it yourself, hopefully with a fresh eye, like it's important to any artistic medium, or have other people sit down and play it so you can then you see the ramifications of what you did. But like putting a 5-minute loop into whether you typed in a less than or equal isn't like you would have done that exact same process inside your own head while typing it in. Right. It just wouldn't have taken 10 minutes.
I'm totally with Chris on this one in terms of like I want to get these things on the screen and iterate as fast as possible, and I don't want to take that critical look at like these slow slogging moments. I've been in that process, and it's painful, and I want to cut my hands off. Like it's awful, and I'd much rather just like.
There's a lot of angst in your world.
I'm a heavy drinker. But like I end up like I want to implement something on my own really fast. It's just sloppy and dirty, and then like show it to people, just have them play it and see how it goes, and like watch all the problems happen, and like start emergently coming up with the ideas that kind of fit into that system from there. And like that slow critical look that you're talking about, that's like the snail running, and maybe or maybe it's like the tortoise and the hare. Maybe the tortoise does win at the end of the day, but it's a lot more fun to be the hare, and it's a lot more interesting to be the hare at least.
Well, let me throw maybe a dumb analogy in here, but I'm thinking I actually don't know which of these two models this is making me think of. There can be like you're talking about closing the gap. There can be a useful gap, right? So if you think about the origins of like rock and roll in like British musicians, listening to African American blues music, right, and sort of like their they don't speak that language. They're not literate. Natively. They're hearing it and distorting it and seeing there's a gap there. But in the friction and in the gap, they produce this new thing, right?
Yeah.
So you could say that that's useful in that sense. Or let me just throw out the other side of this analogy because it could be either or. Or you could say there's just literacy. There's knowing how to read and write.
Yeah, I mean,
right? And
you're-
we don't. No one thinks, it might be better if we didn't know how to read and write. We want everyone to read and write.
Your
So
musical,
is
you're-
it like that?
You were drawing your analogy. I think your musical analogy was flawed because the analogy to programming in music composition is performance, and most of those guys could play.
Right.
They'd hear the thing, they'd hear the blues thing, and then they'd rip it off, and they'd fuck it up a little bit, and like, I like that's the way that sound that works better, right? It was not. They were sitting there and was like, I should really have my guitarist go play this. Like, they were noodling around while they
Right.
did it, right? Like if I could just write up this doc about how to do.
Run the recording studio.
How what?
They didn't know how to run the recording studio, which is really the analogy.
No.
But
Wait,
so let me
the
ask you
recording
this.
studio-
Not to mention
the
composition.
recording-
The music exists without
The
that.
recording
So-
studio is like Perforce and Maya. Like,
So let me ask, play every instrument in the orchestra, right? That's not relevant to the experience.
But the ability to play an instrument
Right.
is
Right,
much
but
closer.
I can play an
it's not-
instrument.
no, wait,
I just can't play the programming instrument.
No, but that's not. It's not. That's not the way. Again, I think this is just be an axiomatic disagreement. In which case, it's gonna be a really short panel. Because if you, it's like arguing about definitions. Like, violin is not graphics, and like electrical guitar is programming, and the drums is audio. That's not how. That's not like all of those things are the core fundamental thing that makes the music happen. And like, there's the style and the tone of what you're playing and whatever. But like, those things are all the programming part. Is like maybe you put a lot of distortion on the guitar, and that is like some stylistic stuff like that. But like the core thing about music is making tones in a sequence in music, in over time. And like the core thing about games, interactive games, or interactive experiences is that feedback loop of present input, grind on it, present output, repeat. Right, and that is programming.
So you're saying that this is the second part of the analogy is more correct. That it is a form of literacy, and it frankly would
Yes.
be better. Like
you're-
literature would not be better if the people writing the stories couldn't actually
Maybe
read
it
and
would,
write. They had no
because
literacy.
Maybe it would,
they had to
because they'd be
describe what
free
they
to
wanted, and someone else
describe-
wrote it down.
They'd be free to describe their
You're
great
saying it's as
ideas.
fundamental as literacy. It's a kind of literacy.
Your
Yeah.
Indicate talk 2 years ago about interactivity is the steam of the 21st century,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I think really was right on, and way to go, man.
Thank you.
But no, so Frank gave this talk a couple years ago about basically how in I guess the 19th century, steam was this thing. It's just like the way society worked, and you can make all these kind of like cultural analogies to the way it worked and everything like that. And like interactivity is that nowadays, and that interactivity has nothing to do with does not mean games. It just means interactivity, like things, your iPhone, everything is like responding back to you, feedback loops. And then games are the aesthetics of interactivity. Games are the thing that take interactivity out of just science and turn it into an aesthetic, art form, craft, art, and I totally buy that. But like that interactivity thing is just the fundamental literacy thing. Is the ability to say, if X equals 5, then do this, and if it doesn't, then do this other thing.
Is that a form of literacy that we are? That are, as a culture, we are all going to, like 100
So
years
Ken,
from now.
I don't know if Ken's
100
still-
years from now, will we teach children to program as a matter of course?
Well, the funny thing is, we
that-
used to teach children to program, we don't anymore, which is terrifying. But Ken, I don't know if Ken's here, but Ken had this thing years and years ago where he was like, all right, what we've got to do is, Bush had just gotten elected. He's got, we got to do teach all these kids to program, so this doesn't ever happen again. Like the idea that like if you teach the kids to program, you won't elect stupid people was like kind of the fundamental tenet of the thing, and I kind of buy into that a little bit. I don't know how you do that or anything like that, but like that procedural literacy thing, that's a big tangent, right? Like I don't know, that's not it's relevant, but it's not like we could easily spend they have new conferences about that kind of
Okay,
thing.
wait. I'm sorry. There you go.
Well, I was going to go a different direction, so if you
Okay, yeah, I want to respond. I want to get away from these metaphors because I can give you examples from literature where the people telling the stories didn't know how to read and write, and they were translated effectively. And who is Socrates?
Isn't that the origins of literacy, though? I mean,
Yeah, but
these
like,
storytellers.
but like, I mean, is Socrates worse as a philosopher because he didn't write his own stuff? We know that Plato didn't write it because we know from other books that Socrates said the things he said.
Yeah.
Plato just translated them into a form that Socrates didn't know and didn't want to know because he was concentrating on something else, and would actually argued against. But that gets into a long tangent. I think that I guess the thing that I keep coming to here is this: that first of all, in that loop you described, when you say feedback, that's not an abstract thing. The feedback has a representation. Right, so why isn't that representation just as essential to everything?
Oh, it's super important. Like if you're going to do a game, if you're going to do what I would call a very high quality game, right? Let's take Braid as an example, just as kind of canonical indie game that kind of tried to hit all the notes, right? Like the art is very important, and John art directed it, right? Like it's incredibly important. I don't think it's as important as programming, like just because it's not as fundamental. Like, and it's also easier. Like the reason you can make a game the size of Mass Effect is because art scales and interactivity doesn't. Like you don't have an infinite number of endings because you can't scale the interactivity.
There's a reason it's easy to outsource art, and
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
not easy to outsource design.
You don't outsource your design to Shanghai, and that's because it's core to the thing.
What about programming?
That's what I mean.
But programming is an implementation of design.
Yeah, it's like, well, I don't
You can outsource
differentiate.
your back-end sound engine if you wanted.
Yeah,
but like,
yeah.
you don't want to
You
do
just buy
anything
that
that's
from
like
Rad.
gameplay system.
Yeah,
Right, so it's fractal there too, right? I mean, that's the
But no,
point.
but it's not as important. Like I love art. I went to art school. I love music. All of these things, they're not as important to games.
I think
as
Puzzle Loop
interactivity.
would make a big argument about Puzzle Loop
that?
and Zuma would make a very big argument about how important art is. To
No,
Art-
it's
art-
hugely
art's very
important. Like, how can it? I didn't say it's not important. It's not as important.
No.
as
I'm
the
not saying
core
you're
thing.
saying it's not
Yeah,
important.
yeah.
I'm saying that like it's a multimedia discipline. It's a discipline that by its nature involves many fields. And I'm saying that like. Yes, of course.
But so's film.
Of course.
So's
Yeah,
film.
exactly.
What separates us from film?
Nothing, but then film differentiates these
Right,
roles,
nothing?
and film doesn't.
No,
well,
interactivity.
Well, but think about it.
Yeah,
Okay.
It's the big
Yeah,
fucking
yeah,
thing
yeah,
that
yeah,
separates
yeah.
us from film.
Yeah, but look, there's a camera at the center of film, and film doesn't exist without a camera. But not everybody working on the film knows how to use a camera or even what a camera is. They don't need to know what that is. They need people who understand what the camera is, and they have relationships that allow them to understand the relationship to the camera and ultimately to editing, which is where film really essentially happens as a result. The fact that the actor on stage, or the fact that the writer of the screenplay does not understand the mechanics of the camera literally, does not make the writer incapable of being a screenwriter. And in fact, if the writer knew how to use the camera, it would make that writer a better screenplay writer. But I would argue that the knowledge of story structure, or knowledge of a historical object, or knowledge of visual composition could also make that writer a better screenplay writer. He doesn't need to know how to operate the camera.
That's all great, but the camera's not programming. Like the camera's like that's what's
So
great.
what is programming in this analogy?
In film, it's
Yeah.
it's
Is it editing?
It's plot,
Editing, I would
character,
say.
setting, like it's all the things about story, right? Like it's all of
That's
those things that
game
in fact the
design.
director does know. What's that?
That's game design. That's not programming. That's game design.
Wait, no, but I'm
Okay,
saying
okay, so
that
let's-
you
let's-
can't differentiate. The camera is not. If your argument, like, this is just another one of those axiomatic things. Like if in the analogy,
Yeah, I sort of get away from these analogies. Let's just drop these analogies.
But are we like yeah?
I
but-
totally agree.
Yes. There's like.
If you're making a film in a music studio,
Yes.
Jimmy Page.
I mean, part of the reason that misunderstanding just happened there is that like I don't think there's a difference between programming and game design because I think it's this continuum.
Right.
Right. And so.
so what are board game
There's a big
designers?
overlap
What are board game designers doing?
Well, let's talk. Actually, let me throw that out.
No,
as
but there's
let me
programming
just
and
hold on a
algorithm
second.
design, right?
Let me just
Like,
throw that out as a new topic. So let me actually introduce that as a new topic, which is I want to question one of the fundamental tenets of this.
Wait, let me clear this up. There is programming that is not game design, but there is no game design that is not programming.
Right.
That's a better way to put it.
So one of the fundamental tenets of this whole conference is that there's a spectrum of games, and they're all like fascinating and interesting and important. And we're here primarily because of video games and computer games, because they've kind of revolutionized the way that our culture is like thinking about games, and they've kind of turbocharged this whole thing that's always been a part of culture. But is there an essential difference? Like, because for some people, I think there is. So some people are come at video games and computer games through the lens of software. Someone like Ian Bogost, is more interested in software fundamentally, and games as an expression of code and interactivity. So is that true for you? Do you think there is this fundamental difference between computer games and video games and other kinds of games?
I just think that there's the Stalin quantity has a quality all its own thing here is just in play. Like the fact that the computer can execute 4 billion instructions a second just changes things. It doesn't. There is no like if you're gonna make an ontology of like algorithmic thought in humanity and things like that. No, there's no difference. But you just can't. When you're playing Settlers of Catan, you're like struggling to go like, oh wait, fuck, I forgot to move the robber. Right? Whereas the computer is like it's just it can do so much more that it qualitatively changes things. I definitely don't think that I don't look down on board games or think they're lesser or anything like that. They're all part of games, but it's just the things you can do with a computer that you can make because the computer has so much on the quantity end of things. It just changes the game. So
Okay,
You given a computer the high fidelity simulation stuff that we like on a board game, right? Like you just couldn't manage that set of rules. You couldn't do that. And you couldn't do it with The Sims, like in a board game fashion that would be as interesting as what The Sims were because of the function and the artifact of the computer itself.
Okay, so this goes somewhere though, because I can pull this argument out, right? So let's take a really sophisticated board game like Advanced Squad Leader, right? Or that's the most sophisticated one I can think of off the top of my head. I know there's war games that are even crazier, but let's just take that one. This is like enormously elaborate lines of sight, morality, morale, like positions of units, terrain, like all that kind of stuff. It's all there, right? So that game design is a highly complex system of many variables that have to be balanced, and all it asks is that a human being moderate it, right? That human being moderate it is what I called before implementation. That is not that's not a process of logic to figure out, and this may be fractal, but you would get to a different part of the pool here. That's not thinking through the system. The system is very carefully balanced, right? And the logic of the system is very carefully balanced. It's just not built to do itself. So, the game designer who made Advanced Squad Leader, there's only two outcomes from this argument. Either that person is a programmer because the act that they did by designing that system that way was programming. They just don't think about it as programming because they didn't type semicolons. Or programming and game design are different, and there's a skill of game design that is system design that encapsulates that part of programming but is not programming.
I think there's a skill of game design. I think there's an overlap, right? But yes, they are not the same. But there is a large overlap there, and that's like where a lot of us function. In the world that I work in AAA at least, most of the systems designers have programming backgrounds, but they don't program like every single day of their lives, and they're just trying to implement their designs and express themselves and utilize the powers of the computer as best as possible. But like the game design in a pure board game sense, that design can always exist on its own. That person's not programming, that is a pure design thing, but they are thinking, like you said earlier, logically and systemically without having the actual nuts and bolts code of doing that.
Yeah, that's what I believe too.
But if you do what Brenda did, if you build your own board game, did she program that board game because she built the little pieces herself and she painted all the things for the Irish game and the Indian game? Is that programming then?
She didn't painting.
Painting, yeah. I've seen
So I think my like argument there is or my answer to your question, or at least my opinion on your question, is that it's what you said at the end. It's like, yeah, how do you define the word programming, right? Like I'm playing pretty fast and loose with the thing. Like I don't actually think of it as only semicolons. It extends to semicolons if you are doing the quality thing that I was talking about. If you're trying to control every quality variable, then it does go to semicolons. If you're not, you threshold it somewhere. Like, and you call everything below that programming, and you call everything above that design. That's fine. I'm just saying, as you turn the quality knob up, that line goes down to semicolon.
Right, but what I would say, this is a point I wanted to make before. I'm sorry. Is it okay?
Please.
Okay. The point I wanted to make before is that, as a game designer, I don't think I have a good idea that I am implementing through these people. As a game designer, I think I have an idea that we are implementing into a good game. And so that thing that we're describing here as friction is not, to me, friction at all. It's like, that's the creative process of making a game with a team. I don't want to have an idea in my head, fully formed, and I'm just like looking for like a bunch of extra arms.
Let me ask you a thought problem, or not a thought problem. Let me ask you if this has ever happened to you. You got a build from a programmer, right? All right, and there was a tuning variable that wasn't exposed through the tuning. Like, I assume you have a tuning system that updates an XML file, and like you make it to 0.7 and you run the game again, right?
Yep.
But there was a variable that wasn't exposed, right? And you wanted to, oh fuck, I really need to adjust that. What happened?
Huh?
What happened right
I
then?
figured out that I needed a variable that I didn't know when I wrote the spec.
Right, but so would it have been better? So you figured that out, and then they went and implemented it, and then you got the thing back, and then you updated your file, and then you
right. And you're saying I lost time there that I could have gained if I had done that myself.
Yeah, well, I mean, and time is a very nonlinear thing when you're in at least for me, like getting out of the zone, like it's a very like chicks in a holly thing, like like it was way worse than the 5 minutes it took him to put it in the XML file or whatever the fuck, however your tuning system works, right? Like, that's what I'm saying. Like that piece right there, like I totally understand. Like, I love the band analogy for making games, right? That's one of the reasons I think it's great that the like what I call the golden age of indie is happening right now. Like 1 to 5 people teams can make these games that are sustainable, make enough money to make another one. You can actually have a band-sized thing as opposed to like Spore was 100 people and God knows how many people are on fucking Mass Effect 3. Like it's like so like that's not a band anymore, right? That's just a fucking zoo. But the band thing is great because you want that level, and like a lot of the games you probably do are at that band size, right?
Yeah.
And but. So there's the collaboration aspect of like of the guitarist plays a little ditty, and then you go like, oh, this would be great if and you got this kind of like organic jam kind of thing going on. But like getting that tuning variable implemented, like that was just cost. There was no upside to that.
Yeah, I think that's the price of the process because there's another side.
But you
to
can
it,
have
too.
that process without that cost.
No, because there's a benefit that comes from that, which is that I need to give it this an example that like. So when I was at my totally destroyed in the recession company Rebel Monkey, we did this game called Fungies where you had like you're basically it was like a collapse kind of game, and Peter Nikolai was programming it, and when we made it, Peter was like trying to figure out how the blocks would fall in the game, and I didn't really specify that because I was like, well, we'll just build it and then we'll figure that out later because I want to see the game first. But while he was doing it, he was like, oh, like, he ended up just sort of by accident when he was programming, putting this little like jiggle motion into it, just like it was just a bug. And he was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. It sort of looks like water. And then he just took like an extra couple hours and he like made it into sort of a motion that all the pieces had. And he's like, yeah, I just thought of this while I was doing this, and I put it together for me. Now, I don't know that I would have thought of that myself.
Of course not.
I don't
That's
know.
not-
So, but having his head in the process, like that was an inventiveness that Peter brought to it as Peter as an artist.
But that's a collaboration.
Right, but that's the
not
collaboration.
friction.
Yeah, but exactly, that's my point. It's like that's not the friction side of it. That's a side of it that came because of that relationship.
No, but that could have happened if you were both you could have multiple people who were programmer designers on the project like collaborating. The artist might come up with a cool thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? But that doesn't have anything to do with like it's not like if you have a thing you're trying like I don't understand how I'm not like being clear about the friction thing. Like it's just like friction and taking unintended upside from collaboration is awesome. But it's like orthogonal to friction.
It's not unintended upside. It's the point. I take that friction because I want that upside, and I don't think that upside.
But you can get that upside without the friction.
I don't think so.
Let me just, at the risk of amplifying the energy even more, I'm curious to poke a little bit at kind of like a labor politics context for this conversation, right? Because making games.
I dropped out of art school. You're going to have to slow down here.
So, well, I'm just saying that the programmer, especially on a big project, is often the person who's kind of like last in the production chain, right? And the guy who has to, the guy or the girl who has to absorb all of the slack that's built up over the course of a project, the one who can't kick the ball down the field anymore because they're the end of the field, the one who has to bear the brunt of slipped deadlines, and the one who often is the person sort of expected to make it work and often in a position of taking orders and needing to deliver on those orders.
Well, at least in a dysfunctional production environment. Yes.
Right, but is this? I just am curious about your guys' experience, whether whether you've ever been in that position of being, a programmer on that scale, whether you've ever been in the position of being a programmer who's basically sort of getting instructions and forced to execute, as opposed to in this more idealistic kind of collaborative environment, or conversely, have you ever had an experience in which there's a programmer higher up in the chain than a game designer, sort of like, and that's been the hierarchy, or like how do corporate hierarchies and structures fit into this question?
So like I've worked only pretty much in AAA, right? And so like at Raven and Wolfenstein we had 80 to 100 people, and Mass Effect probably 150 people. Like the design department on Mass Effect is like 40 plus people alone. So like I could give a story at Raven where basically I was asked to implement a system for a version of the game that was open world that I knew was never going to be fun, interesting. Like I knew this was a bad idea. Every single programmer, designer on the project, this is a bad idea. Creative director is basically telling us to do it. You have to sit there and suck it up and do it. And I did it, and frankly, unprofessionally, so I didn't do a great job with it. I didn't like put my heart into it. I put my 8 hours in, I did it.
Right.
I got the bear up, and I said, look, it sucks. And that could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. At the same time, when you have a team that big, there's visionaries, right? Like the worst thing to ever have on a large team is no vision, like, or no one making decisions. And so, yeah, I have like a room to like design, but there's a vision it all fits into, and I have to go upwards on the chain and go, all right, I came up with this idea. Now let me make sure my boss is okay with that, and then he's got to go. Let me make sure my boss, who's like the franchise director, is okay with that.
Yeah, I think the hierarchy thing happens on all the disciplines. Like there's like. The creative director answers to the EP, who answers to
who answers to the shareholders.
Yeah, exactly. So
and then
it's not. It's like there are grunt designers, there are grunt artists, there are grunt programmers. There's the lead programmer, there's the lead designer, there's the It's like I think that happens everywhere. Like I don't think it's not. I think the person who's tuning the 18 millionth unit like in a fucking Excel spreadsheet and then like has to like export to XML and then like run the build process and then test it 400 times. They're feeling just as shitty as the lowest level guy working on the setup program.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's just an aspect of these giant, horde teams.
Yeah, I'm a small team. Actually, it's funny because I had this conversation with all my front end programmers just recently, and the conversation basically was because every one of them was there late for some reason, and so I sat down and and this is this kind of environment when you're a business owner where you can kind of like talk to your employees and like get them to open up a little bit, and they just started bitching about like this art wasn't prepared right, and I had to fix it, and like god damn it, why can't the game designer just write the document the way I need it to be? And I was letting them do this, and what I told them was like, well look, the nature of this relationship, and this is what I try to cultivate in Flammatics, is the front end programmer is really where the buck stops, because that's where the implementation kind of happens in these small games, and it's like, well then you have an authority to come back to us. Right, like not a responsibility, an authority. You have the ability to nix things going up the chain. There are business needs, but business needs are not, and again, this gets back to the collaborative nature of this. Business needs are not like a specific implementation. The business need is a need. It's a why that has to become a how. And I don't try to come into those meetings with hows or not fixed hows. I come into those meetings with whys. Like we need something that's going to motivate more social play, or we need something that's going to push monetization more, or we need something that's going to make this kind of level interesting because right now we need more levels and these levels don't seem to work. And I will come in with proposals as a game designer, but these are vetted by programmers whose heads are in the implementation. And that process gives the programmer some authority to be like, that's not implementable in the time scale, or that's not possible. And that creates this kind of forest trees thing that I think is valuable.
I can give another example again from, and it goes to level design, but I think it's endemic of the problem. So like we outsourced some levels because we were running behind schedule, or over budget, all that sort of stuff. So this is a common industry practice. You outsource levels, right? And like we gave high level direction. We're like, here's how the levels are. Here's the tool set. Here's the engine. We're here for support. Call us. But they're another studio. I won't name them. And we get the levels back, and they are god awful. Like they're broken. They don't fit into the way the rest of the game is designed. And it's because like all those 1,000 decisions that we have just like sitting next to each other and we talk about, like they don't hear those, right? And they don't see our grand vision. And there's a gap, between the states. So like they don't call to us. They feel there's that like artificial gap that exists anytime we, like if I'm 3 feet away from you, like I'm less likely to walk over and ask you a question to try to figure it out on my own. Like this actually happens. So I think a lot of our problems just come from that communication barrier, and like that's where a lot of the issues stem from.
So you're talking about programmers and specs, right? And these are terrible formats. What is a good format? Like what in a situation where you have to have a spec, right? That a program. What kind of spec do they want, or what kind of spec is the most effective? Like what kind of communication? If there has to be a separation and some kind of communication of a specification, what's the best way to do that?
I always want a spec that's detailed enough that you know what you're supposed to implement, but it gives the person implementing it the ability to express themselves in some way. Because frankly, working as a monkey is not interesting. Like I don't work on games for the good of anyone else selfishly. I work on games because it's the only thing that makes me not completely insane. Like it's the only thing that makes me
Working, dude.
It's like completely.
Do you like pseudocode? Because I write this terrible pseudocode that programmers laugh at, but I think I'm being so like helpful. It's like this,
I don't write in pseudocode because I can express myself just as effectively in actual code real fast.
Right, but would you like to get that from a designer?
I don't necessarily need the pseudocode, but I do want to see what is the system.
Can we put it up in a programming pit as an object to laugh at?
Yeah.
But what I do want to know, what are the different systems and what are their interaction points with each other, right? And what are the core variables that are driving them? And I don't need to know what those core variables are. I don't need to know that it does 15% more damage or 20% more damage. I just need to know it does a little bit more damage, and we'll figure out the balance later. Like that part, I can figure that out and test it and do it, and that's fun. I like doing that. So I don't want to be nitpicked in that way personally, and that's just especially as a senior level person, like a junior level person, you expect them to basically do what you're told, and as you get more senior, you expect to just have more autonomy basically.
Right.
And that's what we want in our jobs, I think.
Right. I'm going to lift the lights and open this conversation up to the audience as a whole. I know people had things to say. Let me start here with David.
So let's talk about friction for a second and visual design. I work on visual design a lot right now in 2 categories: graphic design and then the creation of character art.
Okay.
And the big difference is that in one of those, I'm the art director for character art.
Yeah.
In the other one, I'm the artist. I
Yeah.
do it all myself.
Yeah.
So I know exactly what you're talking about. I don't have friction in the one world, and I have a lot in the other. And I feel that you're exactly right in what you're saying about the lack of friction being amazing. And that what he's saying is that well, what about when I'm the art director? That don't I get all this great benefit from the artists and all the creativity they're adding? I certainly do, but I could also get that if I were able to draw my own characters.
Right.
I could have them collaborate too.
They're separate.
So-
Like you would choose if you could do it yourself. You could not only would you be a better art director, but then you could choose your friend who's an awesome artist in a different
Right.
style that you just don't do.
So that's
And-
supporting you, but
yeah.
now I'll put you on the spot.
All right.
So that we were in total agreement on all that.
Awesome.
And so now,
We
what
can
if
stop
I'm-
there. Next
What if
question.
Now, what if I'm the jerk who comes along and says, "So, Chris, this spy party thing, you should take your head out of that. You should just get out of that zone. You'd be a better designer if you could get rid of this friction in art. You need to just drop all that and study art." And then your response is going to be that art is not as important.
Well, my response actually is I went to art school, so I can draw pretty well. But separate, like,
Not
is,
well
I can't do
enough.
music for
You should
shit.
get rid of
I
more
can't do
friction.
music. Yeah, no, totally. And my response is time is finite. There's no question. Like, time is finite. Like, you can't do everything. Depending on how big of a game you want to make, you can actually do everything at a certain size game, and that's awesome. And my response is, yeah, I mean, there is a hierarchy of importance of things, right? And
Programming is the top of the world.
well, no, it's programming.
else is-
No, it's not that. I mean, design is the most important thing, but it's like I don't differentiate between. I don't. Well, for games,
It's a record show.
but it's consistent with what I'm saying because I
Yeah.
don't think there's a difference if you're going for that awesome quality because I just don't think that you can like you can't communicate that stuff.
So there is a difference in art direction and programming, or art direction and game design, but there isn't a difference between programming and game design at it in a,
No, so,
in a,
so like,
in a
no,
digital
no.
game.
I mean, so as you turn the quality bar all the way up, it all asymptotically goes to 1.0, right? You want to be able to control everything, but you can't because it's just impossible, right? So, but game design and programming converge faster than the other ones do. So, like, it's earlier. It's just more worth your time to master those.
It is. There's a weird kind of idealistic kind of.
But only in my
vision.
arguments, not in any of the other
But I mean, I think it's in a weird way. It's related to programming and computers and
Oh, yeah,
the,
yeah,
the
totally.
Enlightenment vision
Yeah, yeah.
of a
I mean, I
unifying
believe in
system.
stru-
It goes back to the calculus, the idea that
Yeah.
everything is numbers.
Yeah, totally.
And that's an interesting.
But there's probably
This is the second time you've told me I was wrong dismissively to my face. So I actually want to respond.
That was quite
Full speech. And
Yeah, no, it's cool. It's cool. I want to give a response. Which is, I think that we're being very hand wavy about time is limited. I think we're being very, very hand wavy about time is limited. That's
No,
a
no,
real,
I am not-
very serious thing.
No,
And
it's
that-
huge. I
yeah.
totally agree. I don't
Yeah,
think
and I think that
here, look, I'm gonna say it, and like it is design and programming, and then art, and then music. I'm sorry, music people, you're always the ass end of the industry, and you're complaining about it, and it's just not as important. Like I love music. It's incredibly. Wait, it's just like let me finish. Wait, hold on a second. Like, I mean,
Let's let Nick was in the middle of. Nick
before,
was in
can I
the
dig
middle of
myself
saying
out of that tweet really quick, please? Like, it's not like
It's too late.
It's not no like
The
the
Alexander furiously.
it's
like-
not. It's like there is a hierarchy of things
Ass end
that
the
that
industry.
are that's actually wait let me be clear. This is
Finish-
important. This is
finish your
very
thought.
important.
Finish
Like
your thought.
there is a conventional wisdom that they are, right? Like I'm not saying they are. I don't think it's incredibly important. But you go to the GC and like what are the audio roundtables like? Oh, we get no respect, right? And it's because they get no respect, right? I'm not saying they don't deserve no respect, but it is less important than game design in the game.
Okay.
Like it
In
just
some-
is.
what were you-
Why
Okay,
why
and
there
no,
have to be universal?
Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
And by the way, you can throw at me as much as you want. That wasn't meant to be insulting. I actually enjoy it. Yeah, my point is that like all of those skills do apply. I don't think that hierarchy is as strong as you say it is. I think that that there are lots of games I could point to where I feel like the music specifically makes that game possible. I think that
Sure.
and that it is essential to that design. And if that's the case, that you have a limited amount of time, and if it's the case that organizing feedback into your creative process is always going to be kind of sloppy, is never going to be a sort of perfect, seamless, I never have to stop thinking about anything, and also get the perspective of the people involved. I think that a process that intrinsically builds friction and forces constant feedback for all of the delays and time it creates, assuming you have a good process of doing it, is worth it because it builds the collaboration to the very art of building the thing in
I
front.
don't think the scale's up.
Okay,
very
so
well.
let's.
Maybe not.
We just
Maybe not.
disagree on
Absolutely
disagree on whether you want to be able to control where the friction comes in.
Okay, so we got a bunch more hands up. Let's go here.
Yeah, this is a bit more of a comment than a question, I guess, but I'd love to hear your reaction to it. I feel like this, the discussion went in a particular direction, and I think we're mostly talking about kind of the paradigm that you've been embodying, right? Where it's this kind of amazing Renaissance man kind of guy who is in a single body a game designer and a programmer was able to kind of bring his particular vision,
Or hers.
or hers. In your case, it's his.
Wait, you think? Hang out later.
Whereas I think we haven't talked that much about the general case of is it good for a game designer to also be a programmer. I feel like those are actually two kind of different questions, and I feel like we've gotten tied up a lot in the logistics of, would it be better for Nick to be able to go in there and fix a line of code versus would it be good for Nick to, the way that I find it useful to talk about, I forget who I was talking to about this last night, to know more intimately the material, with which he works. That if you'll forgive another crappy analogy, I mean, a painter should know something about canvas, should know something about paint, perhaps. I think a lot of people would argue. If you're working in digital games, you should probably know something about the material with which you're working. That's the canvas, that's the paint. You wouldn't demand that every artist mix his own pigments or her own pigments, make their own canvas. But you would expect them to know something about it. And I feel like that's a stronger, I feel like we could get more consensus around that than around the particulars of, a single genius being able to bring.
So I've worked as like a hiring manager, like in my past, and I agree with you. I think you want a fundamental level, like you want to be at this level for these talents, and something in that level you probably are an expert at, right? So maybe you're not the expert programmer, but you're an expert at pre-production or something along those lines. But you need to have that knowledge. Like when I look at like candidates to hire, like it's not that they don't consider people who can't program, but they better be really, really, really amazing at something else that blows me out of the water. And if I have two candidates that are equal, but one knows how to code or has a coding background, I'm much more likely to like fall back on that person. And so just from a pure jobs and like a large company's perspective, like that, they're more versatile. They can get in the code like late in production and fix bugs. They get in early in production. They can like use their strengths. Like they have utilities all the way along the thing, and that's different because I'm on large teams probably than maybe what you deal with.
No, I agree with every single word you just said.
I think that there is actually a context aspect to this, which is like, I mean, I know a little bit about film history, and I think that like if we were going to make an analogy of where we are relative to film's history, we're about 1905, right? And which is way earlier than most people think. But so the important thing here, no, wait. But back then you did actually know how to operate a camera. So and back, I mean, in days of yore, like you did have to mix your own pigments and those kinds of things, and like part of that. With interactivity is it's so new, we don't really know what the fuck we're doing yet, at least I claim we don't. So it will be different in 100 years. Like, in the same way that film is much more, like you will go to Pixar and work on a nose in one shot for your entire career, right? Like, it is incredibly compartmentalized, and games are just way messier than that, because we just have basically no fucking idea what we're doing yet. So my arguments might change in 100 years, and I look forward to doing this panel.
If we can go in the back. Zach?
Okay. So I guess I would just say, like, yeah, you could game design and not learn programming, but why would you want to do that? Like, what? Like I didn't know how to paper prototype, and then I learned how to paper prototype, and paper prototyping is awesome because I can take these ideas and not waste time programming. I can paper prototype them and like make board games and learn all sorts of stuff. I would never ask somebody else to paper prototype for me. I would do it myself. And the thing with coding, and you kind of touched on this, is like your coder found something in the code that you might not have seen, and that led to something. But you have different considerations because you're doing game design. Like you might pick up on other little things that are amazing in the code that he might not have seen if you were doing it. And so I feel like not doing the code, you're like closing yourself off to a lot of weird little things that like you might find some tweak that makes the game or makes some new game that you didn't really know about. And I guess that's where like it's different than music. It's a lot less likely that music will affect a game change. Like that you'll be composing something and be like, oh my god, if I did that one thing, now I have this new amazing game or this new amazing mechanic. And it does happen. Music is really important. Like but it's less likely. Whereas in code, you're really architecting like the system there. Like say you're working on a game and you hit a button and you're supposed to jump, but it makes you fly, and then you realize, oh my god, wait, that bug is actually this amazing thing. And I think that happens a lot in games, especially in indie games where they're small. And I don't know why you want to.
No, I don't want to not code.
I know.
But this is what I did this year when I could have been coding, and I make stabs at it every so often, right? When I could have been coding, this is what I did instead. I read Super Sad True Love Story. I saw Winter's Bone. I played Ghost Recon start to finish. I played, what else did I play start to finish? I played like about 7 or 8 other hardcore games start to finish. I played tons of casual games. I read about 30 other novels. I read a book of philosophy. All of that stuff informed my game design. Like everything, every single thing I've named informed my game design somehow. And I mean, I don't like go to see Winter's Bone because I'm thinking like, how will I make this into a game? But like, I see that cultural, that because I come from a humanities background, I see that cultural absorption as part of my creative process. So yes, if I had infinite time, the very first thing I would do in that pocket of infinite time would be to program. But
Why? Why start? Yeah, if it's infinite, you do whatever you want.
So let me respond.
Yeah, okay.
I want to say something about Zach's point.
So let's let you guys respond, and then we'll go.
Just really quick, because I was going to mention this earlier, but Zach brought it up. Like that, those moments of like serendipity or unintended upside or whatever you want to call it, whatever every studio has their own name for whatever those things are called. There are an infinite number of them. They're unknowable up front, and there's no like way of knowing what the right or wrong answer. There are multiple right answers, and so the one you would have come up with is different than the one the other person would have come up with, and that's okay. Like it's an aesthetic form. Like you're not gonna like you're gonna stab a little blue over there, and he's gonna put a little green over there, and it's a different painting either way. They both might be awesome paintings, but like it's. You seemed to be earlier making an argument that without the blue over there, I'm missing something. And yes, you are, but you're also missing the green, which is the one you would have done.
Right.
And so like, it's just like, and it would have been faster to get to the green one. That's all we're saying.
Well, I feel that, but I guess what you're saying, I'm saying is true. Like I think I want to be in a band.
Yeah, that's fine. That's great.
And you like the blue.
I think though the difference between the stuff that you did instead of programming and programming is that the stuff that you did isn't injecting any kind of serendipity into the actual construction of the thing. You're learning things and it's injecting serendipity into like what your brain is thinking and all of that stuff. But I think that there's like a real magic to accidents happening in a process. And I think programming really opens up that space for those accidents to happen to the person who's like got the vision and is thinking about the thing, and that's really important. I think.
All right, so
I would argue those things can happen in level design, and that's the place where that happens.
So let's go right here, and then we'll go here, and then back to Jesse, and then over to Jesper. So right here.
I feel like I really agree with what a lot of being said about like the paralysis of indecision for what you do. It's like Persona. Do you go to the arcade and play quiz game? How do you raise your stats the fastest? And I think like everyone has a different focus for that. And I just wanted to ask, especially Chris Hecker, if you look, like interactivity is what makes a game a game. It's essential to it being a game. But I don't think everything has to have the same amount of it. Not everything has to be Tetris. Like L.A. Noire is not the best game, but I liked it more than it would have been if it had been a movie. So I wanted to know, would you be willing to concede that you have your hierarchy of importance? Would you be willing to concede that that's for your ideal game, and there are many other types of interactive objects that would have a totally different hierarchy? Possibly?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I have like, I'm pretty well, it's well published that I have like a certain vision for the way I think the industry needs to go. So like, you know, if we're going to become the preeminent art and entertainment form of the 21st century, the way film was to the 20th, like we have to double down on interactivity because we are never going to catch movies, right? We will always be shitty movies. So there are two ways of getting to what I hope we all agree is the kind of goal, which is emotionally compelling art and entertainment, interactive art and entertainment. Emotional can mean a lot of things. Like it can mean like an awesome game of StarCraft, right? Yeah. And emotions mean emotions more than just power fantasy. We don't want to give up power fantasy. Like you can have your orcs and stuff; it's totally fine. But like we also want all of this other stuff. And so to get there, there's basically like to totally caricature the situation. There's kind of two ways to go about that, right? There's you take like the way Uncharted and games like that are doing. Like you take an already complete emotionally compelling form like music or like film or literature, and then you try and add interactivity into it. Or you start bottom up, focusing on interactivity, and you try to add the emotional compelling stuff into that. I think the former is a complete dead end, and you will bottom out. You will run into an end, and we're getting very close there with things like what was the quick time event game?
Heavy Rain.
Huh?
Heavy Rain.
Heavy Rain. Like you're getting, is it diminishing? Yeah.
It's funny that we named about 8 of them.
Yeah. I call those games theme park ride games, right? Like you've got this thing, it's kind of like you're going through Treasure Island, but it's not really, right? And at the bottom level, you have games that are like really way more coarse from an emotional standpoint, but the emotions are actually happening from the actual gameplay. I think that's a much more, it's the only way to go, basically, if we're going to actually come to meet our true potential.
I need to respond to that really quickly.
Sure.
What you do in Heavy Rain is gameplay.
Yeah. Oh, don't get it.
So the narrative moments that work in Heavy Rain come from the gameplay. There are good moments of gameplay in Heavy Rain that create good emotional response.
So Doug Church made this analogy a long time ago, which is there's more interactive fiction, there's more interactive storytelling in 5 Seconds of Quake than there is in all of Myst. Because everyone who played Myst has exactly the same experience, right? Floyd died in the same fucking way for everybody. But when I came around the corner and dodged the rocket and then headshotted you, that was totally personal story that happened to
You're
me.
conflating interactivity and agency and assuming that agency is superior to interactivity for creating emotional effect and narrative, and I would argue.
Let's not go there. Let's not. Maybe we should go there. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing that I always think about is that, like, I agree with the whole, like, if you're a designer, you want to understand programming, not necessarily coding, but the idea of programming. But, I mean, that's assuming that if you are a programmer, that you are any good as a actual, like, overall designer.
No, that's what I'm saying. It goes one way, not the other.
And then also, like, there's, you know, Super Mario Brothers, it was a very important game on all levels. Like, everybody remembers the theme song. Mario was very important. That's almost important to people in terms of just knowing that they might have gotten killed at the first Goomba every single time when they were 6. They just remember the theme song. That was the game for them. Or the fact that Mario was a well-designed character that was made out of 3 colors based on, like, just some art ideas. And pretty much everything in that game, I'd say, is completely equal. And that's like saying that game, like, the designers actually kind of understood everything, and if they would have only understood 2 things, then...
As you're trying to drive the quality up, they all matter. Can someone please just tweet, Chris Hecker thinks music is important? I do not, like, it's not, like, this is the problem with Twitter.
I'm writing it. At this point, I think the problem might be with you.
I mean, like, it's not a soundbite thing. There's a subtle thing you're trying to say. Like, it's like, they all matter at the limit of quality.
Seriously.
It's just...
Jesse, and then Steve, you had your hand up, right? And then we're gonna go to Jesper.
Kind of ties into what Chris just said about it goes one way, not the other, because I'm wondering about that. I don't see it that way. I want to go back to, we clearly disagree about record making, so I'm going to appeal to his pre-Les Paul mentality and talk about that the most successful song in the 20th century, White Christmas, was written by a man, Irving Berlin, who literally could not play piano, right? He had a lever to change the key because he only liked hitting the white keys, because that's much as he understood the implementation of this. But the fact of the matter is he had interpreters, he had implementers who were themselves visionaries and geniuses, like Bing Crosby. And the programmer in that analogy is the implementer. And if you could trust that implementer to add something to the design, to the skeleton that you've created, then you would have a good product. Why should we not be saying to programmers, hey, you should learn?
No, I misspoke. I didn't mean it doesn't go both ways. I meant it in the way I said it, Eric, earlier. It's like there is programming that is very far removed from design, like the internals of the audio library. Latency matters, actually. Like, I mean, you can make arguments pretty deep down in there, but like you license Miles from Rad and they've done it all right, and like you're fine, right? You don't have to code. You don't have to code everything. Game design programmers should definitely know game design. I think it's the same thing at that quality level. The argument about some people can't do the things in their form and so they have interpreters, like, I mean, you can go to the Whitney right now, there's a whole section of naive art, right? Like, there's a whole name for this, you know, a genre is the wrong word, I don't even know what you call it, a movement or whatever. There's like, you know, some bumpkin in Kentucky, like, they pulled him out and like, the person's a fucking visual genius. That's not the, like, yes, that happens. There's a lot of people in the world. That's not the best way to get the best thing. You don't optimize for that, right? You don't optimize for monkeys typing out Shakespeare. You optimize for, like, being as good at the craft part as you can and also being good at the art part.
I'm not a monkey typing out Shakespeare.
I didn't say that.
You're not. You're a bumpkin from Kentucky.
I mean, what I would say is that like I guess my point, and I think I think this is a really, because I think the heart of this, I'm doing moderator work, I apologize.
Please.
I think the heart of this that I'm hearing in the argument is really the question of like whether programming exists in a special relationship to game design relative to other disciplines in the game field, such that it becomes an essential thing for a game designer to know that's different somehow from art and sound and writing and stuff
It's
like
not
that.
essential because there are existence proofs of people who can't program who make great games.
Right, but then if we put together a hierarchy of skill, right, and we said like if you're going to be a game designer, what should you know? Like programming would be way up near the top and higher than many of these other disciplines. And I think that my response to that, and I know you weren't saying that about me, but like my response to that is it's not monkeys on typewriters trying to take Shakespeare. It's people who studied other things, bringing those other things to bear into the equation and asking for implementers in certain other things that is opposed to...
My point about the monkeys thing was about the naive art thing. It's like, if that happens, with a large enough set of, like, statistical, like, that is going to happen. You have the prodigies, you have things that happen. That is not the way to train people to be the best at the craft.
But my point is, I did train to be good at my craft, but I didn't train that way, and I think that there are lots of other ways to. All I'm arguing is there's lots of other ways to train to that position, and I think this is an interesting debate. I think like I don't know that there's an obvious answer coming out of this panel, but I feel very strongly that like.
It also depends on the kind of games you're trying to make too.
But like, there's all these disciplines, you gotta pick some of them.
I mean, like, the more systemic your game, the more I think it matters.
Yeah. So I want to go to Steve, and then Jesper had his hand up, and Matthew. So.
All right. So yeah, this is maybe more of a comment than a question. I guess I just feel like this is a totally valid argument, but it's a little narrow because you guys, you're coming from fairly similar backgrounds, like either small or indie games. And I mean, when you ask Zach, why would you not want to learn programming if you're going to be a game designer? I think that, maybe coming from my perspective, it's because a lot of game design is content and not code. A lot of game design is content and not systems, right? Like, the reason that I didn't want to be a programmer and I wanted to be a game designer is because I started as a level designer, right? And that's an arrangement of systems and content into the player experience. And so I guess I feel like there's a lot of design that's totally valid that is in conversation with the guys that are making up the base systems into their most effective expression that isn't really represented by the direct collision between code.
But hold on, like you work as a level designer, you've worked on the Unreal Engine, you've used Kismet, I'm imagining, right? Yeah. So if anyone hasn't used Kismet, it's a visual scripting language. Look at like the way like Modern Warfare something is designed. Like you have scripting, like this guy spawns here, then he moves over here. They use a lot of the times visual scripting languages to do that. Visual scripting languages are created to basically make people who don't know how to program be able to accessibly understand basic tenets of programming and make the characters move. I get in Kismet because I have a programming background, and I'm like, this piece of fucking shit slows me the fuck down.
Yes.
This is a piece of shit.
It's
and
a
I hate
total
it.
piece of shit.
And I go into Unreal Script and I just do it, and I do it in like
Which is
10
also a piece
seconds.
of shit. But
it's a piece of shit
at a different level.
And in fairness, it's a piece of shit I understand.
Right.
And maybe that's all it is. But the point is that as a level designer, you still have programming that hits you. Like maybe BioShock's more systemic in its AI, and you actually don't do a lot of scripting. But a lot of games like Uncharted and Modern Warfare and stuff like that do heavy scripting. And level designers do tenets of coding without realizing they're doing tenets, and we're building tools around those tenets. And I think if they had a better base understanding of how to code, if they could get and script it faster, like they could actually be more efficient at their job. Now, would that take away from some other knowledge that they would have about architecture or the world that would influence their design? I don't have a good answer for that. I think it's good that we have outside influences that are not video games, that are not Blade Runner, but like, Blade Runner's like my favorite movie, like every other designer too, by the way. I thought I was unique till I got in this industry. I don't know the answer to that. Like, I agree with Nick on that point, but I think it's highly important, and I think you could have not done one of those things and learned how to basically program, like the basic programming, and you would have been better off for it than the additive the other way.
Maybe even twice the designer.
There's a dinner coming out. Come on.
Let's. I think we have time for two more, so we're going to do Jesper and then Matthew.
All right. I'd like to return briefly to the question of friction and closing the loop, which I think is like a very sort of persuasive argument for the gamer designer, right? the designer programmer. But to use an analogy in a sense, so I'm pretty fascinated with like the breakup stories of big bands. So to take something like the Beatles, it's very obvious that in a way they broke up because they wanted to get rid of the friction, right? So no longer would they have to like communicate with each other other geezers who didn't necessarily know how to implement their ideas, and finally they would sort of, with no friction, make their total records, which would be so much better, which they weren't, right? And so it sort of goes to show that in a way, like that argument for removing the friction only works under the assumption or the case that all creativity must come from one person, right? In all other situations, it falls apart.
But again, I would claim that is we're mixing up different definitions of friction. There, the collaborative friction is what they were worried about. They could all play their instruments. Like Paul and John could both compose music equally well, one might argue, but differently, right? And
Keith and Mitch.
yeah. Right, but the point being that they could both program and design. They just didn't like each other the way they did it after a while, right? And it just turns out they were better together. But they're a perfect example, I would actually claim, of the opposite, which is that you can still get that amazing collaborative, better than the sum of your parts thing with full craft and art at the same time. Because they were both awesome. I mean, you read the stories about how they saw each other and they were just like, fuck, this guy can play his guitar as good as I, whatever. He's awesome and I'm scared of him, but this might be great.
But I just think that in a way, it's at least it's a kind of sort of boring conclusion that in a way you can't entirely generalize it about this question, and it depends a little on what the project is. So
Right, but I just think it's
But
important
generalizing things is something that computers are good at.
But I just think
that's my point. You know what I'm saying? That does play
It's
into this.
important to understand the kind of frictions that I'm talking about that I claim are almost purely cost.
I think you're splitting hairs ultimately. I think these frictions produce exactly the same results, and when I think about the difference between what you're describing and the difference of what I experience in my own ignorance, I see a similar thing. Not again that I'm trying to justify my ignorance.
Nuh-uh. That's my response.
So I have a quick comment, and then I have a real question. I thought the comment about teaching programming and then electing not for people was interesting, because I know a lot of libertarian programmers who really admire Bush's lack of friction.
How long are you holding that comment?
So friction, it seems to be a little bit of an argument between dictatorship and democracy. If you're
Take that up with Ken Perlin. I was really quoting his.
He makes good decisions, so why not, just have a dictator? And but I agree with what Chris is saying. But I have a practical question, which is that there's a lot of phrases that get thrown around like no programming. What exactly does that mean, right? Because some people say,
Wait, no K-N-O-W or N-O programming?
K-N-O-W.
K-N-O-W, yeah. It's like some people say that, and really what they mean is they only know C#, right? And other people mean they don't even know what an if statement is. So I'm wondering if you could maybe give a quick example of being a programmer, working with a designer, and really good communication in terms of systemic thinking or being able to articulate things even though they might not be quote-unquote a programmer. And a really bad example, because I feel like we're talking a lot about hypotheticals, and when I say one thing, somebody else might have a totally different picture in their imagination of what that situation is. And I just would encourage you to be as specific as possible, maybe even just telling about something that happened to you.
I have a good example, which would be I was working on Wolfenstein, and I worked as a programmer for a long time, so I was doing weapons and controls. And so as a result, I was doing aim assist code, which is hey, how fast does my stick accelerate, and what's the graph? Is it exponential? Does it lop off at some point? What's the velocity? And I'm sitting there and do that, and I'm playing Halo and every top tier game to see what they're doing and try to deconstruct it. And eventually, I moved over to design, so I didn't get to finish off what I was doing. So a programmer was going to pick it up. And so we're playing, he's I got some ideas. I'm you know what, those ideas sound good, run with it. Those ideas I didn't have, but try them. Let's try whatever we can to make the aiming better in this game. And he implements some stuff that works, and there's some stuff that I'm not happy with. And I literally had to go I think you should change the value to 0.22. And I'm I think it's probably around 0.3 right now, and it was 0.31. I think he added that. And the fact that I understood the low-level system because I implemented it, and because I had been dissecting these other games, allowed us to get to the answer a lot faster. Or with a cover system, I've gone into a place and gone no, our enter cover animation needs to be 10 frames shorter because look at Gears of War, it does it this fast. And then you pull the example up. And that gets to the root of what the problem is, because a lot of the times you're just this feels wrong, and I don't know why this feels wrong. And I only understood why it felt wrong because I understood how to implement it. And I only understood how to implement it because I implemented it at some point. Now, once I have that knowledge once, I have that knowledge forever, hopefully. Unless I get
Drink
Alzheimer's.
too much.
That
So much bad happens. It's okay.
I lost a lot of knowledge on Friday night. I would put it that way.
Who's president?
So I think we need to wrap it up, but are there any final, does anyone want to have a final word? Any last thoughts, concluding statements?
Comment on board games?
Yeah, do you want to, did you?
Well, that's my question. I mean, so you've been clearly speaking in the context when you say game of computer game, where
Yeah.
there's an intimate relation to programming, and whether or not you need to know them is a separate question. I'm interested in, the panel question was broader, game design.
Right.
I'm a board game designer, and I only care about computer games to the extent that they help me with board games.
Right.
Do I need to program?
Well, I mean, I kind of tried to touch on this earlier, which is like, I think if you're designing, I've never designed a
Something
board.
got us sidetracked.
What's that?
Something got us sidetracked.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like never happens in panels. My opinion about that is that board games are still algorithmic design, right? And so the more you can, if you can program, I mean, if you can program a computer, you will be a better board game designer. I don't have any evidence, pro or con, that because I'm not really in that space at all. I don't, to the extent that board games are algorithmic systemic design the same way that the higher level algorithms of computer games are. I don't see how that's not true, but I mean.
So being a systems designer helps you be a better game designer, but not being a programmer.
Well, no, but the way
So being a programmer helps you think systemically.
Yeah, yes, it's just
like
programming
this
is the
equals
root of
this
system
equals
design.
this.
But yes,
Yeah.
being a game designer means you're a system designer, and you have to know how to be a systems designer to be a game designer. I feel like that's
if you believe in a certain kind of game, and my claim is
But
that it
programming
doesn't.
is different than
Well, but no,
systems
but that's what I'm saying. For me, it's not. I don't think that if you follow that, I think it's a continuum, and as you turn the quality bar up, it just goes all the way to one.
But
I'm gonna say that that's a nice point to end on, because I feel like there is a little bit of a shared sentiment there. So, and with that, I'm going to thank you, each of you. Thank you very much for the panel. Thanks for the great conversation.